Eber and the Great Rebel. The Great Rebel we're going to be talking about is a man called Nimrod. Many of you will already know something or a lot about this man, Nimrod. Over the last couple of days, we've been talking about brethren, men of faith who faced giants. And we've been talking about those fears that loom giant-like in our lives too. No more or less dangerous to our faith and to our survival than Og was to Moses. No less formidable than a Hyman or Sheshai or Talmach or even Goliath. You know, in both the cases of Moses and Caleb, they had one particular giant who loomed. Quite easily identifiable giant, in fact. It was, I think, probably for Caleb, the impact of old age that he battled with. But also he faced other giants too, the giant of prejudice and of exclusion perhaps, being a Gentile dog aspiring to Abraham's promise. Both Caleb and Moses and David as well experienced that weight of peer pressure of a whole nation's concentrated, collected fears. But what we're going to do over the next 45 minutes, 50 minutes or so, or an hour, is we're going to consider together a man who faced a terrible choice. And it appears that this man was willing to stand up to the greatest giant in history, the biggest, the toughest, and the meanest of them all. All the giants, it seems, wished to be able to trace their lineage back to the dead giants before the flood. Of course, they weren't genetically linked. We've already discussed that. But they saw themselves as having a shared heritage. As we considered in our first study, the general term for giants, Rapha, is not even a description of giantism at all, but rather a word that meant the dead ones, the walking shades of long dead monsters, the Rapha, the reanimated corpses, as it were, of the giants who died in the flood, the Nephilim, the Ha-Gibborim of Noah's day. You see, Nimrod, the man we're considering this afternoon, stands head and shoulders above all of these. He is a man who absolutely was taking his cue from the mighty giants, those men of renown, those men who plunged the world into catastrophe because of their violence and immorality in the time of Noah. And even though Nimrod too has been dead for 4,000 years or so, the tower he built still casts a shadow. I'm sure you've seen this imagery before in this ecclesia. The imagery of the way that mankind seeks to undo all God did at the Tower of Babel, and in so doing acknowledges the history of all that Nimrod built, tries to perpetuate all of Nimrod's belief and culture and wisdom, Nimrod's. The kingdom Nimrod established, it lives on, brothers and sisters. We know that, don't we? Its king inspired by his greatness. A dynasty, an unending dynasty, it sometimes seems, of kings who wish to be just like Nimrod. And of all the giants, there were none so significant in the way they influenced the world, none who changed history like Nimrod. And the man who faced him, the hero of faith who risked isolation, exclusion, hatred, perhaps even death to rebuke this giant? It's a man called Eber. I don't know how many of you have studied the man Eber. Hopefully most of you have heard of him. But as we get to the end of our study this morning, or this afternoon, pardon me, we'll talk more about this man. Now, in going through these chapters, we are looking at some of the most ancient of the records. These are threadbare and Spartan in their detail, and of course, detail is lost. Not essential, we know, but nonetheless, it's thin on the ground. And so we're going to have to thread some detail together to build our picture of what happened at this time. Now, Genesis 10, which we had read for us this afternoon. Thank you so much for soldiering through those names for me. Genesis chapter 10 is obviously the chapter just after the end of the story of Noah. It's the what happens next chapter, the PS, if you like, the coda to the flood that drowned the planet. And while initially, as we read through it, seems just like this list of names, it conceals for us the stories of Nimrod and Eber, the giant and his enemy. And really, those are the only two stories concealed in this section, as we will see. Genesis 9, we know what happened there. Noah and the other 7 leave the ark, saved by water, as Peter says, and they step into a pristine new world, a world unstained by the crimes of the Nephilim now dead and buried at the bottom of an ocean. But before long, the lessons of the flood will be forgotten. Or more pointedly, it's not that they'll be forgotten. Actually, they will be actively rejected as men begin to rage against the restraints of a life of faith and of service, and to chafe against a life lived under the rainbow. That last phrase, to chafe against a life lived under the rainbow, it may seem a little weird. How do you chafe against the rainbow? Rainbows aren't exactly itchy, are they? If you find the end of the rainbow, you don't find something scratchy. But you see, the rainbow given in Genesis 9 was there, as we know, to mark God's solemn covenant, a personal covenant between him and humanity, that never again would he destroy all life with a flood. It was a beautiful promise, wasn't it? A symbol of God's earnest promise of divine care and forgiveness. And yet it seems it became to many a symbol of God's watchful eye. Now, I'm going to put up on the screen now a piece of contemporary media. It may mean absolutely nothing to some of you and something to some of the rest of you. My apologies, but this really captures the way I think people saw the rainbow. This is from a book by... who wrote it? Someone remind me. Tolstoy. No, not Tolstoy. Tolkien. There we go. Lord of the Rings. And he visualizes in it the watchful eye of an evil power over the world. I really think that each time the clouds built up in Noah's new world, and each time the rain began to pitter-patter outside, there were those who would feel threatened and fearful, distrustful. And each time they saw the rainbow, they would be grudgingly compelled to live a life they didn't want to, lest the clouds come in anger. People who did not trust the rainbow. These people wanted to live the lives that they wanted to live. They wanted to live a life that was being their best self, whoever that might be. And yet they felt threatened by a vast, multi-hued eye, as it were, in the sky. Yeah, you know what? We know they felt this way. This is not conjecture, because the legends linger. The Hondurans, for example, see the rainbow as a symbol of the devil's anger. Amazonian tribes close their mouths when they see a rainbow, lest malign spirits enter them. And the Karens of Burma, currently so oppressed in that place, see the rainbow as a symbol of impending evil from the king of hell. It says here that Hakuti is seen as the rainbow. He's an evil deity. And if the Karen should point at such a rainbow, he would immediately thrust his finger into his navel in order to avoid losing that finger. There are these terrible superstitions, these legends that are ancient, confused memories of the flood, and people's fear that God would judge again, that God would break that promise and flood the earth. You know, perhaps the clearest, I think this one's quite fascinating, the clearest of these, we'll skip that one, that's the Mexicans, the Aztecs, is this one, from the Pacific Islands. I know it's small, let me read it to you, it's really interesting. This was recorded a couple of hundred years ago by John Williams, a missionary, an early missionary to the Pacific Islands. And he says that Polynesian traditions state that the heavens were originally so close to the earth that men could not walk, but were compelled to crawl under them. Do you get the sense of a people oppressed by the sky? This was found to be a very serious evil, but at length an individual conceived the sublime idea of elevating the heavens to a more convenient height. For this purpose he put forth his utmost energy, and by the first effort raised them, that is the heavens, to the top of a tender plant about 4 feet high. There he deposited them until he was refreshed, and then by a second effort he lifted them to the height of a tree, which is as large as a sycamore. By the third attempt, he carried the heavens to the summit of the mountains, and after a long interval of repose, and by the most prodigious effort, he elevated them to their present situation. For this, as a mighty benefactor of humankind, this individual was deified, and up to the moment Christianity was embraced, the deluded inhabitants of the Pacific Islands worshipped him as the elevator of the heavens. This is a buried memory. The buried memories of races that are fragments of the flood, seeing God as this impressive, angry deity weighing down on them like a low-hanging sky, and the elevator of the heavens, the one who saved all humanity by lifting that oppression away from poor mankind. Who was that? It was Nimrod. And the world remembers this man. And no one knows about Eber. Genesis chapter 10 records names, lots of names, doesn't it? The descendants of Noah, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and so on. Whose son was who and where they ended up. It's the lineage of nations, isn't it? We often come back here in our Ezekiel 38 lectures to show where Magog came from and where Gomer and many of the others as well. There's lots and lots of names. And among these, there are some who strove to keep walking with God, while there were others who just wanted to walk away to be freed from God. Lots of names, lots of places. But you know, in this chapter, there's only 2 names where we are given any more information than just the names. This is a chapter full of names, but there's only 2 where we get any additional history as to who they were, what they did. And the interesting thing is, in both of these names, the ancestor of the person of whom we are given some history, the ancestor, the patriarch, if you like, of their particular family line, is distinguished by their special descendant rather than the other way round. Now that's unbiblical, by the way. The father is greater than the son. That's a biblical principle. But in this chapter, the opposite occurs. The ancestor is elevated by the fact that he had this exalted descendant. Look at verse 8, for example. And Cush begat Nimrod. Nimrod began to be a mighty one in the earth. Cush begat Nimrod. Except he didn't. The sons of Cush have already been listed for us in verse 7 very clearly. And Nimrod was not among them. That word begat there, you see, is, in the Hebrew they have different stems, and I can't profess to be a Hebraist, I'm not, but apparently this is in the Qal stem, something like that, Qal stem, as opposed to the Hiphel stem. But this changes the meaning of the word. When this word is in the Hiphel stem, begat means actual paternity. This is this person's actual father. Whereas here, it speaks more of lineage. Nimrod was in the line of Cush rather than the father of Cush. The child of Cush. Nimrod was in Cush's line. Or more to the point, the line of Cush became distinctive, for in it there arose Nimrod, the giant of the age. We're going to see a similar thing when we come to Eber. Eber's family line will be distinguished because in it arose Eber. And so we meet Nimrod. He's a descendant of Ham. We believe Ham was most likely the father of the African races, among others. In fact, Cush means black. Many of you will already have this in your margin. And this man, we're told, began to be a mighty one in the earth. He began. Or better, he was the first on earth to be a mighty man. So says ESV and Jerusalem Bible and RSV and others. He was the first on earth to be a mighty man. A mighty one. Well, at the moment, when we read that word, mighty one, mighty man, we don't know whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. But you see, because it's placed here in this chapter, in Genesis chapter 10, we have no doubt, because that Hebrew phrase, mighty man, has only one precedent. By the time we've read to this point in the Bible story, there is only one precedent to look back to and see whether a mighty man is good or bad. Only one for Moses to draw on as he writes this piece of text. And really, it's the last mighty one that we encounter in the story. There it is. The last mighty heroes of old were the Nephilim. That's Moses' precedent here. And so when he refers to mighty ones again, that's all we've got to refer back to. At this point in the story, the mighty ones who died in the flood, the Nephilim Gibborim. Same phrase here as mighty in the text, the Gibborim. So here in Noah's new world, there is in this man the first of a new breed of mighty, godless men. And verse 9 tells us he was more than just a mighty man. He was a powerful man of influence due to his prowess as a hunter. We're told he was a mighty hunter. A hunter. Now, I don't know if any of you here hunt. It's not the most PC these days of career choices, but, well, it's not a problem, right? But did you know there's not one positive example of a hunter in the Bible? Now this is, by the way, it's not an exhortation not to hunt. But in terms of the way the Bible viewed hunters within its text, you go looking, see if you can find a positive hunter. Who's the first who comes to mind? It's got to be Esau, right? Hunters in the Bible were generally not godly men. In fact, they never were. But this man is not just a hunter. He's a mighty hunter. And you think to yourself, well, what's the difference? What's the difference between a hunter and a mighty hunter? Well, it's got to be the prey, doesn't it? A hunter has a pigeon on their wall. What does a mighty hunter have on the wall? Well, a mighty hunter will bring down the wiliest, most savage, most brutally intelligent of beasts, won't they? And which is the greatest, mightiest predator? The top of all the food chains? The apex predator of apex predators? Mankind. And you see, the root word here for hunt almost exclusively speaks of those who hunt men, who hunt human prey. And clearly this was the case for Nimrod, for it was by hunting that his kingdom was established. The Hebrew here describes the hunting and his kingdom as cause and effect. Now, I don't know how many hunters you know, but there are very few who I've met who've managed to establish a kingdom by hunting pig. No, this man hunted men. And the result was he carved out for himself an empire. In fact, such a mighty hunter was he that people living in Moses' time, bear in mind that's a long time down the track, in Moses' time, remembered his exploits. They were proverbial. As it says here, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before Yahweh, that's what people would say. Moses' mother would say, oh, it's like Nimrod, the mighty hunter before Yahweh. It's a proverb that people knew. He was famous. And he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Again, the Hebrew means in the face of God. And you know what? That's not in a good way. Nimrod, we're being told, to use a colloquialism, got in God's face. In fact, the same language is used of Korah, who rose up before Moses. He got in Moses' face. The Septuagint says against Yahweh. And here in Nimrod, we've got a mighty man in a bad way, a hunter of men. And almost every Bible dictionary that you look at agrees on this particular fact, that Nimrod, his name, means rebellion, or better, we will rebel. So was this man just a causeless rebel? A nonconformist? No. He had a real purpose, an agenda that he was prosecuting. We've already covered that. This man rebelled against God himself. Keelan Delitzsch, one of a few very solid Bible commentaries, says this, of the Old Testament, says this: the name itself, Nimrod, from the Hebrew, we will revolt, points to some violent resistance to God. It is so characteristic that it can only have been given by his contemporaries and thus have become a proper name. Well, Keel and Delich are saying here is we don't actually know what Nimrod's name was. It could have been anything. It could have been Gerald or Frederick. We don't know. But his contemporaries called him the rebel against God, and it stuck because he was. So to the 12-cubit question now. Was Nimrod a giant? Clearly, he was a man gifted with physical prowess as a hunter. This enabled him to build a kingdom around his personal might. And as we've already noted, he began to be a mighty man. That Hebrew phrase there, the Hagerim, the hero, is a word used both of the Nephilim in Genesis chapter 6 and also of Goliath in 1 Samuel 17. But it's also used of many other mighty, non-giant men. So it doesn't prove the point one way or the other. The Septuagint translates verse 8 of Genesis 10 thusly. It says, and Cus, or Cush, begat Nimrod. He began to be a giant upon the earth. Look, to my mind, that's not compelling proof that he was a physical giant. But I think we could safely say he was a giant in every other way. Firstly, in the eyes of his contemporaries, he became the biggest, most important man in the world, a titan in politics and religion, in warfare. Much like the giants of industry today, I have this old newspaper article, and some of you may or may not remember the faces of the people in this, but it's describing giants of industry who were felled by their own corruption. And like these men, like Bezos today, and Elon Musk, and so many others, Nimrod cast a long shadow, and he built an empire that lasts till our era and beyond. And secondly, verse 8 told us that he was the first on earth to be a mighty one. And you think to yourself, well, he's clearly not the first in the sense of time, is he? Because, well, the Nephilim before him had already been mighty ones. He's not the first in point of time. No, he was the first in rank. He was the one who became the top rank mighty one, the first on the leaderboard of dictators and strongmen. If you had a board of the toughest, baddest, most evil, most corrupt dictators of all time, Nimrod would be right at the top. That's what we're being told. In fact, the ancient memories of Nimrod and the stories that surrounded him went from wherever Nimrod was and spread into the rest of the world. They were copied into many other cultures and races. The Greeks, for example, captured this idea of a great hunter hunting across the universe, and they built it into their own mythology. Here is a piece of poetry by Virgil. I think Virgil was actually Roman, but nonetheless, Virgil writes, once more the proud Mezentius with disdain brandished his spear and rushed into the plain. You're amazed that you're all hearing fluent Greek, aren't you, and understanding it. But nonetheless, we'll move on. Where towering in the midmost rank she stood, like tall Orion stalking o'er the flood. Tall Orion was one of the Greek deities who marched across the heavens. Even today we have a constellation called Orion, the giant, with a dog, a hunting dog. Orion is mentioned in the oldest Greek literature dating back to 800 BC, and they describe him as a giant constellation, a hunter with hounds, a giant hunter. In Arabic literature, the same constellation, Orion, is called Al-Jabbar, the giant. And so, Nimrod may not have been a physical giant like Og and Goliath, but an ambition and an achievement and an ungodly empire. He towered above them all. Verse 10 tells us that the start of his empire was Babel. The story of Babel, of course, is in Genesis chapter 11. And this was an empire that started through his accomplishments as a manhunter, as a rebel, as a man of renown. Actually, when you think of it, he was engaged in 3 key fields of endeavor. He was a man who was focused on the military, on the religious, and on the political. And he was a giant in all 3 spheres. He started with Babel, we're told, or Babylon, the gate of God, as it means in Babylonian. But that's not where his empire building ended. Verse 11, out of that land went forth Asher, and builded Nineveh and the city of Rehoboth and Calais. From there, he went to a land later to be called Assyria and built Nineveh. The next few verses in the Hebrew, they're very, very confusing. They're very hard to put together. But a better commentator than myself suggested that the next few words should be read, Nineveh, which is a most vast city. He built several other cities, but his epitaph here is that he built Renown between Nineveh and Calais, which all 3 of them combined to form the great city. The great city. Not a great city. The great city. This man built Babylon, and when that project was stopped by God, he built the great city. A city made of 3 parts: Renown, Calais, and Nineveh. And 4,000 years later, what Nimrod started with Babylon and perfected at Nineveh falls. We know this passage. The great city was divided into 3 parts. The cities of, we might well say, Nimrod fell, and great Babylon came into remembrance before God. So Genesis chapter 11 tells us the story of the building of Babel, and while it's clear that there were lots of people involved, Genesis 10 confirms for us that it was Nimrod who was the architect of Babylon. He was the thought leader. It wasn't someone else's idea, it was his. Come across now to Genesis 11 verse 4. Genesis 11 verse 4, because here we understand what was going on in the minds of people as they worked on this project that was the foundation of Nimrod's empire. The people said, let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. So, they had several goals. They wanted to reach heaven. And what was that about? Early space exploration? No. This is where we started. They wanted to wrest control over their lives from the God of the rainbow. What they wanted to do is they wanted to let a man stand up there at the pinnacle of the towers and argue with God, fight with God, Let a man stand in the heavens and let him become God for them. They wanted to make a deity in their own image and elevate him into the skies. And you will note that if you've got a King James version, that phrase where it says, may reach unto heaven in verse 4 is in italics, telling us it's not in the original, it's supplied. And so this phrase could be read, a tower whose top is the heaven. And the Tower of Babel was called the Gate of Heaven when it was constructed. And it suggested that its top was adorned with the horoscope, man's attempt to predict and control his destiny using the stars. You know the shtick. Jupiter is rising in the house of Venus. Today is a good day for roast beef sandwiches. And people think they have control of their... It's still in the newspaper every single day. Well, whatever was at the top of this tower, Nimrod planned to dethrone God. And the other goal here of the people at this time, guided by Nimrod, was to make a name for themselves. Now, the Hebrew word for name is, of course, Shem. Shem. Now, this is, I think, the biblical version of a Freudian slip. Nimrod planned to replace Shem. Who was Shem? Well, Shem was the priest of the Most High God. He was the one that Noah had appointed to be the mediator for all earth. And Nimrod wanted to get rid of Shem, to become the Shem himself and enthrone himself on high, establishing himself as both high priest and king. In fact, he wanted to go one step further. He wanted to be high priest and God in one. He wanted to replace the God of the rainbow with a God they understood, a God who would let them live just how they wanted. That's what he wanted to do. You know, Josephus, writing of these events, where is Josephus gone? I've lost Josephus. I'll read this for you. Josephus, writing of these events, said this. He, that is Nimrod, persuaded them not to ascribe it to God, that is their accomplishments, but to believe it was their own courage which procured that happiness. Did you hear that phrase? He persuaded them to believe that it was their own courage that would let them procure their own happiness. That's an incredibly modern sentiment. Be the person, the best person you can be. Find yourself. Be your best self. You can do it, the world says, again and again and again. You will find happiness through what you accomplish. You know, Nimrod, though a godless tyrant, promoted the fiction that happiness is something we can achieve, that it's gotten through what we do. Not due to God's goodness, no, happiness doesn't come from there, but from our own personal efforts and endeavors and victories. You can hear the language of Nimrod sometimes in the ecclesia, and when I do, it really scares me. I want to live my best life. I want to be my best self. We're not going to turn there this morning or this afternoon, but Colossians 3 verse 2 to 4 says, and when Christ, who is our life, shall appear, then we shall live effectively. We are dead in Christ, but when Christ, who is our life, shall appear, then we shall live. And the point of that, Colossians 3 verse 2 to 4, is that we don't have a life. As believers, we died with Christ. We don't have a best self, a me to find. We are dead. Christ is our life. But Nimrod said, no. You'll be happy when you get rich, when you lose 5 kilograms, when you find yourself, when you finish this tower. And he promoted the focus on self, this modern perspective of self-empowerment and glorification. Truly, this man was a giant of humanity, devoted to banishing God, empowering sinners, and glorifying self, who set up a system of society that now almost totally fills our globe. It's Nimrod who did this, right where we are now. That's Nimrod. What a giant. And most of you thinking, yeah, so what of Eber? Well, Eber first shows up in chapter 10, verse 21. And notice here in this passage that just as Cush was distinguished by his connection to his descendant Nimrod, Shem here, though great, is distinguished from any other Shems that might have been out there by being the ancestor of Eber. Unto Shem also, the father of all the children of Eber, the brother of Japheth the elder, even unto him were children born. Now Eber's not his son, not even his grandson. He's way down the line. It says here, now this Shem, just so you know, he's the one who led to Eber. That one, the one who led to Eber. Who was this Eber? And what did he do that was so important that he almost trumps Shem here in the record? And why is Eber mentioned in verse 21, way out of sequence in the history? Eber's not born till verse 24. He's the great-grandson of Shem. Well, what makes him more important than Salah or Arphaxad before him? Well, verse 25, we're told that unto Eber were born 2 sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. He had 2 boys, and he named one of them Peleg, which means to split, a division, or an earthquake. For it seems that soon after the birth of this little boy, an event tore the world apart. An event so significant and dramatic that Eber named his son after it. We know what that event was. It was the violent division of the world after the events at Babel, when God confused humanity and introduced a Babel of competing languages overnight. But you know, when you think about it, just naming a son hardly qualifies as an event worthy of the attention given to Eber. Oh, they named their boy Phoenix. Right? That's not so impressive to name a son. So what was it that he did? Well, I think there's a clue in the name Eber. Because Eber means simply beyond. Beyond. To have crossed over to the other side. And just as Nimrod was named by what he did, I think Eber was too. Because I think this is what Eber did that made him worthy of notice. He picked a side. The other side. The other side to who? Well, Nimrod, of course. In the face of a violent man, a hunting, godless rebel, a man who had the whole world in the palm of his hand, Eber publicly chose the other side and everybody knew it. So much so that he lost his original name, whatever that was, and became that guy on the other side. And it appears he did it alone. Genesis 11 verse 1. And the whole earth was of one language and one speech. You see, what this is saying is that it looks like almost everybody was on board with Nimrod's God replacement plan. One language, one speech. You think to yourself, well, that's saying the same thing, right? One language, one language. Well, see, language means language, but speech means thought process, subject of communication rather than means. And what we're being told here is that the whole world had one language and one mind on this matter. So much so that in verse 6, God says that the people are one. Behold, the people are one to do this thing. The whole world had one language, one. And they were one in thought. They had one plan to build Babel, a gateway for the new God to enter. God Nimrod. And everybody was on board. Except Eber. He made a stand, it appears. He crossed over. He made a choice so obviously, so clearly articulated that it changed everybody's memory of him. Eber, oh, that's right. He was the one who changed sides. In fact, his stand is so significant that when Moses wrote the record of the children of Shem, 9 generations, thousands, even tens of thousands of descendants, of all those descendants, the one that Moses flagged as the best, the reflection of the best character of Shem's family, the mascot of Shem, the one who was blessed of Yahweh, it was Eber. He was the one who changed sides and left Team Nimrod. I want us to realize what a terrifying giant of a choice this would have been. All the world, the whole earth was one, marching, as it were, to the drum played by Nimrod. This was not a stand that could be overlooked in an age of general nonconformity. Oh, they've got a spinning wheel. It's the age of Spotlight and Kmart. It's not like that. They're a little odd, aren't they? They make their own kombucha. That's individuality. That's a whole different thing. That's interesting. This was not one man and the whole world. Nor was Eber's stand like the one that you may remember Israel Folau made recently. Risky, but one that many people were sitting at home and nodding and saying, well, I think that was the right thing to do. Not life-threatening either, was it, for Israel Folau? But Eber, on the other hand, said no. And he said no to a merciless hunter of men, a giant of divine rebellion, a man so violent and so powerful that thousands of years later, the Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs, even the Pacific Islanders remembered him as a giant hunter in the sky. This would be more like standing up to Mr. Putin, knowing that your next step was likely to be off a 9th-story balcony. The fear of standing alone was what Eber faced. Sin in giant form threatened the truth, and only Eber crossed over. And we hope that after him others followed. But nonetheless, because of this act of faithful courage, Shem became known as the ancestor of Eber's children. The children of the one who separated himself from the whole world. And who were these children? Well, have a look. Here's one. And there came one that escaped and told Abram the Hebrew. Well, Hebrew. What does that mean? Well, Hebrew means to be a descendant of Eber. Did you know that? Here's Strong's Concordance, patronymic from a number, an Eberite, that is Hebrew, or descendant of Eber. Abraham was a Hebrew. Why was Abraham a true descendant of Eber? Well, because he separated himself from didn't he? He crossed over. He separated himself from the world and all it stood for and went over to the other side. And because of that, not because he was the direct son of Eber, but because of that action, he was called an Eberite, an Eber-rew. Here's another one. Joseph. Here's Joseph in Potiphar's house, and that woman called unto the men of our house and spake to them, and saying, See, he hath brought in a Hebrew unto us. Why was Joseph a Hebrew? Well, Jacob tells us in his promise at the end of his life, he says, The blessings of thy father Joseph have prevailed against the blessings of my progenitors unto the utmost bounds of the everlasting hills. They shall be on the head of Joseph and on the crown of him that was separate from his brethren. He separated himself from his brother's sins and chose the other side, the other way. And he was a descendant of Eber. Oh, here's another. Now this one's interesting. Jonah. They said unto everyone to his fellow, Come, let us cast lots. And the lot fell upon Jonah. Then they said unto him, Tell us, we pray thee, for whose cause is this evil upon us? What is thine occupation? Whence comest thou? What is thy country? What people are you? And he said to them, I am a Hebrew. Why does Jonah say this? You know that chronologically in the record, the last time that someone called themselves a Hebrew, David was not yet king. And now, after hundreds of years, Jonah pops up with this phrase, I'm a Hebrew. Why? Where's he going? He was on his way to the great city, wasn't he? The home of Nimrod, to stand against it one more time. And to stand in the place, he thought, of Eber. Right, one last one before we finish up. And this is one who this day is about. One who truly crossed over and picked a side, who stood utterly alone against the giants of sin and death. Hebrews 7 says this, For such a high priest became us, who is holy, harmless, undefiled, separate, on the other side from a world of sin. I want you to come to our final passage, Micah 5. Because you see, it's this one. It's this descendant of Shem who will finally defeat history's greatest giant. Micah 5, for those of you with an Oxford and find that Micah moves, page 1130. Micah 5. We know this passage, don't we? Now, says Micah in verse 1, gather thyself in troops, O daughter of troops. He hath laid a siege against us. They shall smite the judge of Israel with a rod upon the cheek. But thou, Bethlehem, Ephratah, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of thee shall come forth unto me that is to be the ruler in Israel, a prophecy of the Lord Jesus Christ. His goings forth have been from old, from everlasting. And what does it go on to say? Well, look what it says in verse 4. And he shall stand and feed in the strength of Yahweh, in the majesty of the name of Yahweh his God, and they shall abide. For now shall he, not them, be great unto the ends of the earth. This man shall be the peace when the Ashurian shall come into our land. When the Assyrian will tread in our palaces, then shall we raise against the Assyrians 7 shepherds and 8 principal men. And they shall waste the land of Assyria then with the sword, and the land of Nimrod and the entrances thereof. Thus shall Jesus Christ deliver us from the Assyrian when he comes into our land and when he treads in our borders. The end of Nimrod, conducted at the hand of the greatest Eberite ever.